Hi, and welcome to the Red Team Draft Podcast. I am your host, Alex West, and today I'm joined by the usual complement of Connor Harr, Eustacchio Raulli. No Josh Earl, unfortunately, he is traveling today, but we do have a guest, and it is the Setpien's Mr. Cole Zwicker. So I'll start with you, Cole. How are you today, sir?
Doing well, man. It's kind of a fun time of year getting to conference play, so it's fun to see more of these prospects and see our initial observations and how they pan out over time.
See, sometimes that's not fun because sometimes you have the expectation and now you have to take it down a couple of notches. So I don't know if I'm as high on that time of year when my expectations get knocked down a peg. But joined, as always, by the prodigy himself, Mr. Connor Harr. Connor, what's up, my dude?
How you doing? I'm wearing a North Carolina hoodie. Nobody can see it, but it is solely in honor of Leaky Black.
All right. And, of course, the executive producer, Mr. Eustacchio Raulli. Eustacchio, how are you?
I'm great. My Syracuse Orange got the flukiest win ever against Duke the other day, so I'm doing good.
So here's the thing. Put a pin in this because that's something we're going to have to come back to because I want to talk zone defense. Not today, somewhere down the line. I want to talk zone defense because zone defenses are up like 200% in the NBA this year. So maybe your Syracuse Orange are making an impact. Anyway, that's not why we're here today. We are continuing our series we started last week. We talked about Zion Williamson. Today, we're going to continue to break down the 2019 class, and we've decided to do a little bit of a comparison between two players. Now, you can sort of take this comparison whatever direction you like, but the two players that we've chosen to do today are Duke's Cam Reddish and North Carolina's Nassir Little. We feel like these two players are sort of competitive for the same draft spots, maybe not universally replaceable, but they sort of fit into the same mold. So we're going to break down Cam Reddish first. We're going to break down Nassir Little second. And then we're going to do a little bit of a comparison. So I'll go to you, Eustacchio, if you want to do the introduction into who Cam Reddish is and what he brings to the table, and then we'll kind of break him down from there.
So Cam Reddish is a 6'8" wing. He's a very fluid player, very nice shooting stroke, and versatile defender. And he was very highly rated coming out of high school. Has had his ups and downs so far this college season. So what are your takeaways so far from this college season, Cole?
Yeah, mine might actually be kind of a minority opinion. I think he's kind of in the role that you want to see him at the next level, as far as mostly an off-ball gravitational shooter where you can really leverage his off-movement shooting. I don't think you want to play him so much on ball. I know he played point guard at lower levels, but I think he should be really thriving in this role. And I think he just had a bad shooting spree where he was really off. Maybe his confidence faltered for the most part, but generally, I think this is what he is at the next level. I want him in that Otto Porter Jr. kind of role where you just really leverage his shooting. So that's who I think he is. I like the team defense. It's just it's really rare that 6'8" wings with his kind of ball skills and shooting ability that know what they're doing defensively for the most part fail at the next level. So I think he's just a really safe projection.
Listen, I think this is as good a place as any to transition and talk about his on-ball role because Cole hit the nail on the head. When he said, that there is a need for these guys who play off ball, who kind of attack the game outside of being primary ball handlers, even though sometimes we want to put him into it. And I think talking about his on-ball skills is interesting because you do have that kind of sharp dichotomy between, yes, he was a player who can initiate, who did so at a lower level, and yet you want him to do something besides that at the next level. So, Eustacchio, break down our on-ball offensive scores, and then let's talk about it a little bit.
So for our scouting grades on ball offense, we have him graded as a 6.1 in ball handling, 5.0 in passing, 6.5 in shooting off the dribble, and 4.4 finishing off the dribble. And we didn't grade him in post play because he really hasn't displayed that at all this year.
Yeah. So with his on ball equity, I'm kind of more in agreement with Cole about the off ball stuff. On ball, I think he's probably an above average ball handler, a little upright for me in his stance when he's handling, doesn't really get too low to the ground. he's more of a change of pace guy. He likes to play his on ball actions off of his hesitation dribbles between the legs. Really likes to change pace off the dribble to try to create separation for his pull up jump shot, which I think would be his most appealing trait as an on ball player. And overall, I think finishing off the dribble is something that we kind of see him lack with right now because of his strength concerns. He struggles to go up when stronger defenders and big rim protectors challenge him with verticality, and it sometimes leads to some turnovers or him not being able to get his shot attempt up above the rim. And finishing in the post, I actually did grade because I thought that with his length, he could be somebody that sort of kinds of takes advantage of switches and be a mid post kind of isolation guy where he could pull up on just over defenders or with 1 to 2 dribbles.
I'm a little bit different on Reddish. I think that there might be some on-ball potential with him. He definitely has good handle. His passing vision's a little bit above average, I think, compared to the position group at the NCAA level, particularly for a kid that young. I think he's got pretty decent vision. I think that he's a solid distributor. One of the things that I do worry about is as he heads downhill, he tends to get blinders on and sort of neglect people, particularly in the low corners. But I kind of like it because maybe you don't want him handling the ball 20, 25 minutes a night as your primary initiator, but I think that ability to initiate as a secondary creator is something that can actually really bump his stock up because, he's got great tools. He's got great length. He's a good defender. I think he's got some motor questions, but I think catch and shoot's going to be a nice part of it, but being able to maybe work him in as a second unit ball handler or do something like that, I think could really give him a dimension that you don't see with a lot of guys in this class.
Yeah, so Alex, I wanted to ask you this question. I'm curious to get anybody else's thoughts that are interested in it. And particularly some of my concerns, at least on ball, is he does have a tendency to get a little bit too sped up, especially as a transition handler or in isolation or in space when he's facing a good amount of point of attack defense where he can get a little overboard and not play at his normal ideal pace that he likes to play out on ball. And I wondered if that would contribute to any of your concerns with him sort of playing as a more on ball player.
I mean, I definitely think there are concerns at that level because, like you said, he gets sped up, particularly when he's pushing the ball into a defense in a transition opportunity. One thing I'm a little bit more confident about is I actually think he's a pretty solid ball handler in a half court. And when he, catches the ball on dribble handoffs, or maybe sometimes, they swing it around to him and he gets to attack a warp from time to time, it looks like he's really comfortable in those situations. And I think, Connor, what you're hitting on is a lot of his youth in play, is that he is a young guy. He's a guy who doesn't really quite know what his role is. And I mean, we talked about this a little last week with Zion, is there are a lot of good basketball players on Duke's team, and finding your niche in that is a little bit more difficult. So I think that as he progresses as a player, as he ages, I think that there probably is some potential for him to slow down, to play within himself. But I definitely think you've addressed a legitimate concern.
I do kind of like his pull-up shooting on the ball. That's probably the one thing that stands out to me. He doesn't look good going downhill to me, but I will at least note that the context plays in there. When he has the ball in his hands, there really isn't many players on Duke that are spacing the floor for him. RJ Barrett is okay as a spot-up shooter. Jack White is okay, but he's usually running into multiple defenders around the rim, and he's just not equipped to handle those situations. So maybe with more space at the NBA level, this part of his game blossoms a little bit. That said, I think the pull-up shooting is probably the most appealing aspect of it. I'm not too big on his passing skills. But again, opportunities have been limited. What do you think about his on-ball game, Cole?
I'm just trying to refocus like how we talk about him to just understanding that he's going to have a role off the ball first and foremost. Like that's his value. I think he can do a lot of the things you guys are talking about. He can dribble, pass, and shoot. He can make some simple reads. I think his handle has looked a little bit loose this year. Ben Rubin, who writes for the site, postulates that he could possibly be looking at the ground while he dribbles. That you see some lack of spatial awareness with passing and also ball handling. You see the clear explosiveness issues. This is someone who came into college basketball, and a lot of people made the Tracy McGrady comp or the Grant Hill comp. He's just nowhere near that caliber of athlete. If you want to watch Tracy McGrady his rookie year in the NBA, it'll blow your mind. He's not that explosive. So what I'm trying to do is basically say, like, yes, he can dribble, pass, shoot. He can initiate at times secondarily. But what we have to realize is the value is off the ball first and foremost. That's how you get to that safety to value, that floor. This is the same problem I think people made with Brandon Ingram, is trying to profile him as a primary when Cam Reddish is a much better shooter than Ingram, I think, first of all. But you want him more as a secondary, tertiary ball handler and really to leverage that shooting. So that's just kind of how I'm trying to refocus the argument a little bit.
So, Cole, let me jump in here and ask a question. I mean, I know we got to move on and talk about some other things, but I think you bring up a really interesting point is like, okay, you want him to be a secondary or tertiary creator, but there's a chance that if he falls into a high draft spot, he's not going to get to play with those players. Do you think that's something that could hamper his development if he comes in where, if he's in a situation like Ingram was in his first couple of years in Los Angeles, where he becomes a primary guy? Do you think that's something that can hamper his development?
Yeah, that's a really great question as far as developing any kind of bad habits on the ball. I think you can look at it both ways. Like, he would probably develop his ability to read the floor. Like, I don't think Brandon Ingram was like a basketball savant when he came in, but he had some feel. And I think operating those pick and roll settings gave him, a better understanding of how to read the floor. It hasn't really materialized to a high level. But you don't want to overutilize someone in a role that they're not going to play in the future. I think you want to get them more adept at making reads off the ball, relocating, coming off screens, and just getting used to that kind of player. Because as much as we like to think that players can just shapeshift and become different players as far as their mentality, that doesn't really happen that way. Like, people think that RJ Barrett's going to come into the league and just all of a sudden be this off-ball guy. It's not going to happen. So that's why I kind of like to put guys in roles that they can succeed in and have them develop that way.
All right, let's switch over and talk about his off-ball benefit on the offensive end. Eustacchio, do you want to break down the scores for us?
So our scores for the off-ball section are 6.3 in movement, 3.0 in screening, 6.0 shooting off the catch, 5.3 shooting off movement, and 4.5 finishing off movement. Cole, do you want to expound some more on what you envision him becoming as an off-ball player in the NBA?
I like some of the off movement shooting potential. He hasn't really gotten the balance down, but even against, I think it was against Army in the third game, you saw him come off like a pin down from like 28 feet, set his feet quickly and hit a three. I think that kind of ability to leverage that shooting off motion at his size, even though he does have a slightly lower release point than some of these guys like Otto Porter, who can shoot better and like fadeaway jump shots from mid-range. But when you can get someone that size moving off the ball, I think that has a lot of gravity impact. I don't think he's as athletic as a Paul George type, but similar concept in the NBA. Those kinds of players command attention, and they don't capture, the stats don't capture that as far as their command off the ball. So I do like some of the footwork, the 1-2 stuff. He's much better with his feet set. I think that's pretty clear so far, but I do see the upside with him as an off movement shooter. Some relocation ability to the corners, some cutting ability. He's better like off those quick rip throughs. I mean, that's kind of a hybrid of on and off ball, catching a ball on a closeout and attacking. We saw that reverse in this last game, that hang in the air move. So I like him off rip throughs, and I think working off the ball, he has the stride length to get into the rim. And the finishing is a different issue as far as explosiveness, but you can see the foundation for a pretty dynamic, high leverage shooter off the ball.
Now, a week or so ago, you came out with that article with the detailed breakdown of shooting mechanics and how you evaluate them. What do you see in Cam Reddish's shooting mechanics?
I think when you start and just look at it conceptually from like 30,000 feet, it's just a really easy ball that he shoots. It's really effortless. He can shoot it from NBA range already. That's something you really got to look for. Are they shooting all their shots at the college three-point line, or is it extended back? And he's definitely extending it back. Ideally, it'd be a little bit higher, but it's quick enough at his size that I'm not really bothered by it. That's more of a mid-post kind of issue. If he can shoot over the top of these bigger wings, we haven't seen him in the mid-post. I think you guys made a great point about that as far as that's huge to his development. That's the difference between a Robert Covington who can't post up anybody, so he's straight 3-and-D, and the difference between a wing scorer who can really make you pay in those situations. But overall, I think the overall shooting process is really fluid. When he's set on balance, I think he's got to improve his footwork. But yeah, I think that he definitely profiles as a plus shooter.
That's what I wanted to touch on, Cole, is the way he relocates. I think he's a really good relocator off the ball, but I do worry about how he sets his feet as he goes into cuts to receive the ball. I feel like it's a little bit, maybe uneducated might be the wrong word, but it definitely feels like his feet aren't quite where they need to be. Is that something do you think you can improve as you age, or is that just kind of something that's inborn in that basketball IQ level?
I mean, ideally, you'd like a player to have that, like Ignaz Brazdeikis catches on the hop basically every single time off the catch. And that stuff is just polished. If that's ingrained in your head, you're always on balance. I think the elite shooters like Trae Young, for example, so good at hopping into a shot off the dribble. Always good to see that kind of balance. But I do think it's improvable, especially when you have that coordination, you have that body control. I think over time, I think he's going to learn. I've seen enough 1-2, enough hop. It's not perfect, and he can definitely clean it up. But he's shown enough to where it's not like a loss for me.
Yeah, I mean, because to me, that's one of the big pluses is how well he does relocate in terms of his position on the court. I think he sees open space really well, and he will work to get there, and he's usually good. The only thing that I had noticed was he gets kind of choppy with his steps as he goes into those things. But I think that his ability to impact the game off the ball is pretty solid, and I see him as a guy who – ideally, you probably don't want him attacking the teeth of the defense off of a warp, but that's the kind of thing that he can do. But he's a much better catch and shoot, relocate and shoot kind of guy, in my opinion.
Yeah, I'm with you. I'm with you guys. I felt the same way. I said that earlier, but I think Cole hit on a lot of things that I liked, and particularly the stride lengths of him getting to the rim, sort of attacking off the dribble and spot up situations, and also his shooting off the catch, which has been phenomenal for the most part this season when he's not really working off movement. Other than that, I think that another thing to bring up is when you see sort of his shot creation off the dribble in the college level. I think that's something that every NBA player that has that sort of off ball offense, almost every NBA player that has that off ball offensive threat has to have. Is one of the concerns that I brought up with Josh Reeves before in the past with you guys, where he doesn't really create his own shot at all, and that kind of hurts sometimes, especially when you're coming off screens looking for a 1-2 dribble pull up or a step back move. It's a lot more effortless for guys. It seems like for guys that have that collegiate shot creation ability to be able to add just that necessary value that you need off the ball.
So let's go on and talk about his defensive profile. A lot has been made about his tools, about his physical abilities, about the way he plays defense, but I think there's certainly some questions. So Eustacchio, give us the breakdown on what you see on his defense.
So our defensive grades, we had him as a 5.3 on ball, 5 off the ball, 5 in help and recovery, and then a 6.5 as far as switching, and a 5.3 as far as impact plays. So pretty average across the board, except for in the switching category where we gave him a bump. And I think this lines up pretty well with his impact. He's not, I don't think he's the best defender on Duke right now. I would say Zion and Trey Jones even probably make more of an impact and drive their defensive success. But Reddish's presence there contributes greatly to the overall function of the defense because he's so versatile. He can match up with all sorts of different players. He's long. He creates a lot of steals. And so I think that just having that plug and play versatility where you can use him in any defense in the NBA, he can keep up with a wide range of players. That's something that could be, it makes the fit so easy at the next level. What sticks out to you about his defense, Cole?
I think you kind of touched on it. Just by nature in the NBA, the bigger you are in the wing, the better. Typically, you rarely see guys who are 6'4", 6'5", who are dynamic defenders. You have to have special qualities like playing above your size, physicality, elite athleticism like a Tony Allen. Like Cam Reddish is 6'8" with a 7'1" wingspan. Like he's big enough to where he's versatile and he's going to be a problem in the passing lanes. I've seen a foundational ability in the passing lanes. I like his anticipation. It's not perfect. He messes up like all freshmen do, messes up rotations, doesn't help him recover at times, gets lost on pin downs, loses his guy on flare screens, for example. But I think the overall process, it's to a point where I'm comfortable with. Like he had a really nice lob breakup. I think it was in the Maui Invitational Tournament, and you just don't see a lot of freshmen make that play. And he's done enough of that where he's got good anticipation in the passing lanes. I think he's going to be an overall plus team defender, maybe not an elite one, but solid. He knows where to be for the most part. I agree with you guys' analysis that he's not the best defensive player on Duke. I think that's probably Trey Jones. Zion Williamson is like a hyper version of Cam Reddish as a team defender. Zion gambles a ton, but he really creates events and he's really smart. So, I think I'm comfortable with him. I'm not so comfortable with his switchability. I like him. He's got like a wide stance, and I think that he's big enough to where he's not going to be a minus. I think he's going to be a slight positive, but I don't think he has the athleticism to be like this wing stopper type.
One of my big concerns about his defense, and I know we kind of grade this in a different section, but I do want to touch on it here, is like one of my big concerns is I don't think he's a very good defensive rebounder. For a guy his size, and, we talked about his wingspan, 7'1" wingspan, he's 6'8", he's a big guy. He is not rebounding the ball in defensive glass tremendously well. And to me, like, I don't know how much of an impact, like how much that should bring down what you see in his defensive tools. But I do think on the whole that defensive rebounding is a really underrated part of counting who a defender is, because if you can end possessions, you've effectively played defense pretty well. And to me, that's something that's like a little bit worrisome for a guy his size. But Cole, how much do you worry about something like that with a player who's going to be playing a 3, maybe some small ball 4 in the NBA?
I mean, honestly, I tend to devalue rebounding pretty much across the board, especially defensively at the next level, just with how much teams now bail out and try to play transition defense. You know what I mean? Like, it's just that's the skill I'm most likely to move on, especially for like a wing type. But I agree. I mean, he's not a great defensive rebounder. He doesn't really pop there. He's not a great leaper. So I think you have to factor that into the analysis too. He's not like uber strong, even though he's going to have a size advantage if he plays the 3. But if I'm looking at his defense, I have much higher value areas where I look at as far as team defense awareness, switchability. I think rebounding comes in, unless you're a center, then it comes in more dynamic fashion. But for Cam Reddish, I mean, I agree with you. He's not a great rebounder, but that's not going to really offset me as far as looking at his defense overall.
Yeah, I tend to agree. It is a weakness. Like, Duke as a team doesn't do very well on the defensive glass. So the opportunities are there and he's not taking advantage. But it's more of the type of thing that might mute his overall effectiveness a little bit, but in the grand scheme of things is something that can easily be overcome. And I mean, get a few plus rebounders at the other positions on the floor and not a huge deal.
See, I'm going to disagree with you guys. I'm going to throw it in here, and I'm going to say I actually worry about this a little bit more because I think it limits the versatility of lineups you can put around a Cam Reddish. Like Cole said, he's not a tremendously strong guy. He's not a guy who rebounds the ball at its highest point. He's not somebody who is overwhelmingly physical. And to me, that kind of downgrades him in the ability of like, what kind of lineups can we put him in? And if just in a vacuum, if I'm looking at a guy who's 6'8" with a 7'1" wingspan, who I don't know anything else about, I think to myself, yeah, that guy can play some small ball 5 in the NBA today. When I look at Cam Reddish, I do not see that at all. So I'm maybe a little bit higher on what his defensive, on how much of a problem his defensive rebounding can be. And maybe I'm too high. It's possible. I've been wrong before, and I probably will be wrong again at some point. But that to me is what the worry is because it speaks more to the lack of defensive versatility or lineup versatility when you play with Reddish.
Yeah, I think the lineup versatility is a valid point because if he's not able to play up, even as perhaps a small 4 as often because of that issue, it does limit how valuable he becomes to a team. Part of the appeal is the versatility that shooting and defense work in any lineup. But if that size doesn't enable you to play a smaller lineup, then what options is it really opening up? That said, I mean, rebounding is a much bigger deal in the college game than it is in the NBA.
For sure.
You don't have any NBA teams with a 40% offensive rebounding rate like North Carolina does. So, I mean, it matters, but I mean, there's very few teams that are really going to go after that weakness. And it's hard to pick at that weakness specifically. I mean, rebounding is a very high variance thing to begin with. Even if you have a better rebounding team, you're going to lose the rebounding battle about a third of the time. So, I mean, I don't know. It matters, but I don't think it's anywhere approaching a fatal flaw issue.
No. And please don't mean like take it that's how I'm pitching it. I just think like, hey, if we're going to get in, we're going to kind of look at the picture of Reddish. That it's not an inability because like he'll probably be fine at the next level, but that like concern about stepping him up to the next position, I think is valid. And maybe it's overblown because like you said, like the high variance of rebounding is a very important issue. And maybe there's something at play, with him at Duke this year. But I just thought that was interesting and worth talking about. So I'm glad I got to like take your perspectives in on that. Also, Connor said that there's no such thing as a bad shot if you get the offensive rebound. So, I mean, something to think about.
We'll just
That
say
was
with
more
Reddish,
of a Carolina joke.
like as far as rebounding goes, I think we have to point out that Reddish does have a monster frame. Like he's going to be able to add strength. So I said strength right now. I think he gets tossed around, and I don't think he has a physical mindset, which was a good point you guys made. As far as I don't think he's one of those guys who really wants to play down positions, and he's not going to play small ball five. He's just not wired that way. As far as his approach, He was a point guard at lower levels. I think he's more of a perimeter player as far as his approach to the game. But I think he's going to fill out really nicely, and I think he's going to be able to hold his own on the glass. And really, that's all I look for from a player that size.
And perfect segue again, Cole. It's like you read the show prep because let's go and talk about his physical tools. He is a player who brings some interesting stuff to the table. We've touched on his leaping ability. We've touched on his frame. But Eustacchio, break it down for us.
So for physical tools, we have him graded as a 6.3 in speed, 6.3 in agility, 5.5 in leaping ability, 5.0 in body control, and 5.8 for his frame. So one question I just want to pose to the group, and whoever wants to build on it, go ahead. But I think Cole made a really good point about the possibility of him adding weight to his frame. Now he has this great 6'8" frame, and he's very long, but he's not a physical player. And how much do we think he might be able to evolve in that respect as he does grow into his frame?
Eustacchio, I think that I touched on this a little bit last week with Zion Williamson, and I'm going to say it again, that once a kid goes from eating cafeteria food, ordering 2 a.m. pizza, to having a nutritionist, having somebody who focuses on their body, everything changes for them in terms of strength, durability, all those things. So I think there's a lot of possibility. I think the limiting factors are in the actual frame itself. And I feel like he's got good, strong shoulders, good, strong hips. So to me, I don't see a ton of issue with him being able to add length and strength. Now, I do think on the flip side of that, it sort of depends on where he ends up in terms of their strength and conditioning programs. And I think that will be a huge driving factor. But I think physically he is capable.
And I will say for him putting on strength, I'm not that worried about the impact on the athleticism because I don't think he's a dynamic athlete anyway. So if he's going to add 10 pounds, I don't think he's going to lose a ton of quickness. He's not the most bursty athlete, and the lack of explosion, I'm not sure if that's ever going to get there as far as being a plus. So he's one of those guys where he's going to rely on his size, being agile enough, but being in the right place at the right time and being an impact player because of his frame, because of that functional length in the passing lanes, for example. So I'm fine with him adding strength. I don't think you have to worry too much about the impact on the overall athleticism, which contrasts pretty starkly with Nassir Little.
Yeah. All right, so let's move on and talk about his intelligence. Eustacchio, give us the breakdown there.
So we have him graded as a 5.5 in court awareness, 4.7 in situational awareness, 4.8 in decision making, 6.0 in decisiveness, and 5.3 in anticipation. So, Connor, what sticks out to you about his intelligence on the court?
Yeah, to me, and particularly on the offensive end of the floor, I feel like he's capable of making pretty simple reads. I think that his decision making as a passer probably could improve a little bit, but he's pretty unselfish. He's willing to make extra passes and stuff like that. I think he struggles a little bit with his awareness on the defensive end of the floor, and particularly when he's asked to make more than one rotation defensively, and when the play in the half court sort of breaks down, which is something that you see from a lot of freshmen really, and they struggle to figure out where they're at, and they're scrambling to figure out who they need to get to. Overall, I think that his lack of decisiveness, and particularly as a ball handler, is something that sort of limits him as well, where if he's in higher usage action, he'll have a tendency to sort of miss open guys and see them probably like a second or two too late, sometimes force turnovers that way as well. Um, Overall, I don't think that his intelligence is something that's going to hurt him, but I don't think it's really something that's going to aid him either and give him sort of an advantage over not being sort of a tremendous athlete.
Colt, there are a lot of questions, I guess, with Tre Jones going down, being out indefinitely, about where Duke goes from here. And that's not really the focus of the podcast, but I do think it brings up an interesting question. Do you see Cam Reddish benefiting from this period where Tre Jones is out of the picture? Do you think he'll assume a little bit more of the handling roles, do those kinds of things, and be able to showcase a little bit more in this decision-making area, particularly on the offensive end?
I definitely think he's going to get the chance to. He's going to get higher usage on the ball, maybe some more pick and roll ability. We're going to see him featured a little bit more on the ball if RJ permits it. We'll kind of see how that evolves. But over time, I think we're going to see it's at least going to be more than what it was with Tre Jones. I think he's going to be more maybe of a transition ball handler. We're going to see him in more high leverage projectable settings on the ball and see where the decision making is. I agree with pretty much everything Connor said as far as his IQ doesn't really pop for me on either end of the floor in dynamic fashion, but I like to look at guys as like foundational ability. I think he has foundational instincts that I'm comfortable enough with that I don't think he's going to be a liability on either side of the floor. I think he's going to figure it out, but he's not like a basketball savant.
I do think he shows some nice flashes of anticipation on the defensive end. I mean, he is really long, so that contributes to the steal rate. But when you're on a team with 3 other first-round draft picks and you're leading the team in steal rate, I think that speaks to his ability to see some things before that they're happening and react more quickly than opposing offensive players expect. And so I'm a little bit higher on him in that regard, but overall, yeah, I agree mostly with what has been said here. It's fairly neutral aspect of his game.
So let's talk about what is not, to me, a neutral aspect about his game. Let's talk about his hustle. Eustacchio, break it down for us.
So we have his motor graded as a 4.3, his offensive rebounding graded 2.8, defensive rebounding graded 4.0, transition offense 5.8, and transition defense 5.0.
Yeah, and to me, this is one of the big concerns, and I kind of want to see what you guys think about it. I really like what he brings to the table as a basketball player in a vacuum. What I don't like is how often I feel like he kind of goes out to lunch on the effort end of the ball. Now, Cole, is that something that you see, sort of similarly, that his effort waxes and wanes depending on where the game is? Because, look back on Saturday, he's super engaged in the FSU game. Sometimes he's out to lunch. Do you see that as a big issue for him? Because I don't personally think that motor is something you learn. I just think it's kind of something that you have.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And I think that's kind of been his MO dating back to AAU to high school. Is like he doesn't always bring it on a nightly basis. He doesn't have that RJ or Zion gear where they have that competitive fire on the floor at all times. And when you're looking for a star caliber player, how many stars in the NBA don't have that fire? Not many. I mean, that's like critical aspect. And I think that's kind of how we reshape the argument. It's like, okay, maybe he's not the guy. Maybe he's just an ancillary piece, but a very valuable one. So I totally agree. You don't see that, Zion crashing down on the floor, diving, 10 feet for the ball. You don't see that level taking it like a Jaren Jackson, for example. Those guys are rare cases. I don't see the mindset and the mental approach to the game that's consistent with necessarily a star caliber player.
I'm pretty much the same on the motor as well. I was going to bring up the high school stuff since I do watch a decent amount of high school, but that was always a documented concern. I wanted to sort of transition into his transition value on both ends of the floor, and particularly we could just start on the offensive end, really, where I really like him as a transition offensive player. I think he has enough handling coordination to be a transition handler, and he can make simple reads in transition that are pretty easy for him. And I also think that he's shown a tendency in the past few games to really have a good feel in the transition offense of finding the open spots on the floor to get open 3-pointers, whether it's just simply running the proper lane to the corner or just finding the open spot, sort of trailing it like a wing position. I think you saw that. I believe it was in the FSU game where he really did a good job creating open looks for himself in transition by being able to fill proper lanes and finding open shots.
Yeah, I definitely think he has transition offensive potential. I do worry about his transition defense a little bit. Sometimes he's just not quite where he's supposed to be, and a lot of that is probably, like Cole said, he's a freshman. He's young. He has to learn all these kinds of things. So I will be interested to see what his impact is, and if he is that critical complementary piece that can add to a team, or if some team takes him we want him to be the guy. I think that there's two mentalities about him, which make him a very interesting case. But let's flip over and let's talk about Nassir Little, UNC's Nassir Little. Eustacchio, break him down for us, and then let's get into the tail of the tape.
So Nassir Little is a very dynamic athlete. He's explosive and great rebounder, big, strong frame. But again, sort of like Reddish, he's had his ups and downs this season, mostly downs, to be honest. But there's still a lot of intriguing aspects to his game. So one thing I thought was interesting at this point of the season is to look back and see how he was perceived before the season, because he really hasn't gotten to display much of his skill set yet. And Cole wrote a great article in the summer breaking down the skills he displayed in high school. Do you want to talk a little bit about perhaps the aspects of his skill set that we haven't gotten to see yet, Cole?
Yeah, sure. I think first it's important to contextualize what he is now. At least to my eye, when I watched him at the All-Star circuit, I watched him some in AAU for that piece that you noted, but he looked like a different kind of athlete to me. He bulked up a lot since the All-Star circuit, and now he looks more like a 4/hybrid big than he does a wing. And I think I see that in his movement skills. He's not as quick. He's lost a ton of wiggle. He didn't have a ton of wiggle as it was, but he at least could get by guys. He looked somewhat shifty at times, but now it looks like he's huge. He's a tank, but he's not moving as well as I thought. So at lower levels, I thought, the lateral agility, he had a tendency to reach a lot. So it was hard to really analyze his isolation defense because he'd always swipe and let guys drive by. But when he really engaged, you saw that in the All-Star circuit, like against Cam Reddish, mirrored him, blocked a shot on the 3. He stayed in front of Zion Williamson famously twice and stripped him, I think, both times. So you saw a lot more of that. And I was like, okay, this guy's like a rare athlete as far as that goes. He can switch. He's got this incredible frame. He's got the length too. So this is some of us are thinking maybe this is like Kawhi Leonard, and I never do that, but I kind of let myself go there a little bit just because of the length too in the shot making and kind of his fluid stroke. And now fast forward, he added this weight, and this is kind of what we talked about with Cam Reddish. It's negatively impacted him on the floor, in my opinion. He's just not the same caliber athlete. And I think that factors into his projection. It could be an inefficiency. If you look at it and say, NBA strength and conditioning, if you get him back down to that previous build, maybe you gain something that people don't expect. But yeah, to me, it just came down to the intersection of switchability on defense. I was a fan of his mechanics at lower levels. I thought he showed some shot versatility as far as off the dribble pull-ups. He could really shoot over the top of guys, shoot with backward momentum in the mid post. He was actually had a pretty good post game from what I saw, and he could shoot an NBA 3 off the dribble. So there was a lot of upside there to me, even though his touch I don't think is great. We've seen some really bad misses this year as far as just really hard misses off the glass. But that was the idea coming in, and I think it's two parts. It's one, he hasn't gotten a chance to really be featured, but also it's like he's not the same player to me.
Let's break down his offensive scores really quick, and let's do on ball and off ball, because I have a question that has been eating me up and I want to ask it. But Eustacchio, give us his offensive scores so that I can ask this burning question.
We have his ball handling graded as a 5.0, passing 3.8, shooting off the dribble 4.8, finishing off the dribble 6.8, finishing in the post 6.0. Movement is graded as a 5.0, screening 6.0, shooting off the catch 4.7, shooting off movement 3.0, and finally finishing off movement 7.0.
Okay, so I got to ask the question. And Cole, you wrote the article. You talked about him in high school. Now, I didn't see a ton of his high school stuff, but I've seen a lot of his college stuff. And one thing that has stuck out to me is how often he misses long. And I started looking back on it, and I read the article that you wrote when we were doing show prep, and it looks to me like his mechanics are different. Is there anything have you noticed something like this? It just looks a little bit different? He's kind of a forehead shooter. There's a little bit of dip in his mechanics. And then when I was watching his AAU tape, it looked a little bit different. Is that something you've noticed?
It definitely doesn't look as clean to me, the overall process. It looks like he's off balance a lot of the times, too. He'll shoot these really awkward kind of half runner type shots where he's like kind of moving back as well. I don't see the balance on the footwork. He's not getting into that consistently every time. I think it's a little bit different. So that's why we see a little bit maybe of the different kinds of harder release point, just because he's not shooting the same way every time, in my opinion. And he's really settling for those pull-ups. It kind of reminds me of Hamidou Diallo last year at Kentucky. When he didn't know what to do, he'd just shoot the pull-up. And I think that's what we're seeing with Little a little bit. The game's too fast for him, and the ball's coming out hard. So I definitely agree with you. I don't see the same touch necessarily, the same consistent mechanics that I saw at lower levels. I think he's been working on his mechanics. You see this with guys, prospects will change and alter their mechanics. Mikal Bridges did this, and it just drives me absolutely nuts when you have a guy like Nassir Little has that foundation. But yeah, I think it's definitely fair to say that he's not shooting the same way, at least that I saw at lower levels.
And I think that lends itself into something else that you touched on and was like one of my major points about his offensive game is his role, or the way he's been utilized at Carolina, is not the role that I think he's best in. And I think that, you know, maybe he is a 4 at the next level if he stays bulky. Maybe he's a 3 if he slams down. But I certainly think this back to the basket kind of thing that they do with him a lot is not where he wants to be. And you know, Connor, we talked about this a little bit earlier. Yesterday, we were talking about how much his role his draft stock will suffer as a result of his role. Do you see anything in his game like that pushes you one way or the other into, do you want him to be more of a big man? Do you want him to be more of a wing guy?
Well, I think ideally you want him to be more of a wing guy, I would say. I definitely agree with Cole because, like I said, do a little bit more high school stuff. He's not the same player. He does not have the same burst at all, like he specifically talked about. I've been talking to you guys for a few days now about how stiff I think he is as a handler. I mean, he is really low to the ground, which is probably one of his only good traits. But I mean, it's not an overly tight handle. I just think he has more confidence handling the ball, which is why you'll see him do occasional dribble moves, but they don't really do anything to get him anywhere. It didn't really do a lot at the high school level either, where like he was really like shaking past and like dropping guys on the ground and stuff. But he had the burst to where that sort of like lull you to sleep with his moves in the isolation kind of worked out. We don't see any isolation from him really, but for the most part, I feel like he's a very perimeter oriented 4, even though they don't involve him in a lot of offensive action. I mean, he's still on the perimeter, which I guess is not really okay, but a little bit more than just like your typical play finisher kind of role where he's posting up like 100% of the time. I believe spot up is his highest synergy possession rate, or whatever you want to call it. To me, I think that you see with his offensive game, if he doesn't have that same burst at all, I feel like there's not really any kind of on-ball value in his game. I think that the off-ball value in his game is something that you want to try to hone in at the next level, hope that his shooting consistency can come around. And like Cole said, he has had a bunch of bad misses. And one of the biggest things that I really want to see him do is just being able to finish off of momentum, because I think that's one of his most marketable offensive traits as an off-ball player, is how well he's been able to finish off momentum, sort of coming off screens and being able to take 1 to 2 dribbles in the lane and finish with power. Because even though he doesn't have the same burst that he used to, I think he still has a pretty decent top speed. And that being able to get him going off a screen sort of lets him get to his top speed a little easier. But overall, I think the passing is also a major concern. I think that that's one of the parts of his game that's going to tie into the off-ball level, because you see guys at the off-ball level with that handling coordination, and once he develops his shooting consistency, not really be able to round out their whole game because they can't pass off the dribble, which is something that we've seen very little of from Nassir Little at all this season. So I think the role does hurt him a lot. But like I said, I mean, he's really not the same player. I think going into this season, we kind of thought that he would have a little bit more of an on-ball role, similar to Reddish. But at this point, I mean, Reddish is still the same player, but Nassir just really isn't the same player.
North Carolina doesn't utilize a lot of side-to-side action in their offense, so you don't get a ton of ball screens, but I definitely see that as one of the upsides of Little. Yeah, I think he's a really good screener, and I think once he gets his momentum moving downhill, he's a guy who can finish. I actually kind of worry about him finishing from a standstill. He's gotten blocked quite a few times this year. The way he jumps well off 2 feet. But if he jumps off 1 foot, it takes him a long time to get to his apogee. So there are some concerns with his ability to finish around the rim for me, but I don't necessarily know that bothers me too much, particularly if you use him as a guy who can operate away from, he's a big man or even a 3 who can operate away from the rim as a screener, which I think, once you get him moving downhill, he's very strong. He's got good core strength. He's a good leaper off 2 feet. And I think if you can get him moving towards the basket, that is his best role on offense.
Yeah, and I think that sort of speaks to the fact that North Carolina really hasn't used him in a way that optimizes his current skill set. Adding all this strength, it could make sense if you're going to run off-ball action to get him the ball moving downhill towards the hoop. Like there was one play in the Harvard game where Cam Johnson set a screen on the wing. Nassir Little got the ball headed towards the hoop. He finished powerfully and drew the foul as well. And just simple actions like that could take advantage of that strength, that explosiveness, and utilize his skill set right now. But the way he's being utilized, that type of play is very rare. The inactivity of him in the offense is stark on film. He's always on the weak side, and they're just never running things through him. And so, I mean, I think it's interesting how much he's changed from who he was in high school, but I think it's also interesting that how much the situation is impacting him and making the numbers seem worse than they really are, worse than his skill level is. And it's evaluating him is such a challenge because of that, because on all of these plays, you're trying to parse the situational factors with the how his game has changed, with trying to figure out what he can actually do. And it's just so difficult because he's playing less than 20 minutes a game as a guy who came in as the number 3 prospect in America. It's kind of staggering to me that they don't want to feature him in their offense. But it is what it is. And so we have to do the best we can with the film available. So I think the pre-draft process is going to be very important for him, because that's when he will have a chance to perhaps show greater diversity in his skill set, because realistically, I don't think it's going to happen down the stretch in conference play or in the tournament.
And I just want to say, I think there's definitely confidence issues with him right now. You can kind of see it on the floor. He's not being empowered necessarily. I think that goes into being featured. It's kind of like he's an ancillary piece. And to Roy Williams' credit, I don't want to just kill Roy Williams. It doesn't look like Nassir Little's ready as far as mentally in the game. You'll see him, he'll mess up actions when they're actually trying to involve him on the play. He'll be late to set a screen or, pop out. And you'll see, if you watch Roy, you can tell by his reactions that he's not doing what he's supposed to do. It's kind of like the Kevin Porter thing with USC. He's just not ready to function in that offense because he just hasn't had enough time there. So I don't think the game has slowed down enough for Little to really partake like maybe we think he can. So that's just another element. But I do agree. There's some confidence things with freshmen like this. He's clearly not comfortable on the floor.
Let's turn over and talk about his defense a little bit. We've spoken a lot about what his role is on the offensive end. Eustacchio, break down his defensive scores for us. Let's talk about that a little bit.
We have him graded as a 6.0 on the ball, off ball 4.3, help and recovery 4.7, switching 6.3, and impact plays 5.0.
Cole, let's start with you on this one. Where do you see his ideal defensive role at the next level? I mean, obviously he's played a lot of bigs. He's guarded a lot of bigs. I've seen situations where he's kind of gotten dusted on the perimeter, where guys have just kind of blown by him. Where do you see him fitting into an NBA defense?
Yeah, that's where I was going to go, first of all, because that was the idea for me coming into the season, was this guy can really switch. He has the frame where he can switch potentially 1 through 4, maybe some small ball 5. I think the Stanford game at the beginning of the year against KZ Apollo, where he was just getting dusted off the bounce. And it was just he's gotten beat a lot this year, one-on-one. And that's something I did not expect. I expected the struggles with the off-ball stuff, as far as he's not the most instinctive reactionary team defender. He's late to rotate. The game's a little slow. Again, he's always a step late, I feel like, to do these things. But I expected him to be a much more dynamic switch defender. His best trait to me is actually lock and trail defense, where he can trail guys around screens because he's fast, and that's a simple assignment for him. And he can just run through screens because he's so strong, and then his length will contest there. But outside of that, I mean, I've been pretty underwhelmed. I don't want to sit here and kill him because I'm actually a big little guy. I really believe in him as a person, but you just haven't seen it on film this year. There's nothing really you can point to outside of his frame and his length. If he's not going to have that kind of agility, how valuable is the overall defensive package?
Yeah, that's what I worry about. And he also doesn't create a lot of instances defensively. That's something that, he's not blocking a ton of shots. He doesn't generate a lot of steals. He doesn't jump passing lanes. I don't think his anticipation's that great. I think that kind of contributes to what you're talking about. Like, what is this whole defensive package when it comes to who Nassir Little is? I mean, Connor, I'm going to throw you the same question that I did on offense. And I just want to ask you, like, where do you see this guy playing? Is he a 3? Is he a 4? Who do you want him defending ideally when you get him to the next level?
I think ideally you want him to defend wings. I think that I'm probably a little higher with his on-ball defense than most of you guys are. I feel like he's improved on both sides of the ball throughout the season, where now that we're getting into conference play, I feel like he's doing a better job both on the ball in space and off the ball. I mean, I still don't think he's very great off the ball, and I still don't think he's very great on the ball. But I still think he still has I still think he has plenty of value. I think that he's probably like wings, maybe the occasional 4 on a switch because he's strong and he can handle a 4 down low, or on the perimeter. He'll definitely have at least the speed advantage there against 4s. But overall, I think that you sort of want his value on the defensive end of the floor to come from being an on-ball defender, and that was something again we saw in high school where he really embraced the defensive end of the floor, and particularly on ball as sort of like a point of attack defender. I don't really think that he can do that with more dynamic on-ball players, but I think he can still be sort of have some kind of value as an on-ball defender, not as much off-ball though.
All right, so let's talk about his physical tools. Obviously, we've talked about his strength. We've all touched on that a little bit. Eustacchio, break down what you see. Break down what our scores are on his tools.
We have his speed graded as a 6.7, his agility as a 6.0, leaping ability 7.3, body control 6.0, and his frame graded as a 7.0.
Cole, does this kind of stack up with what you see for him? I mean, you touched on his strength. You said lock and trail, said he's got good speed. What do you see in terms of his physical tools projecting to the next level?
I think he's a plus and a potential like sub-elite run and jump athlete. You see the speed, you see the strength. When he can load off 2, he's a good leaper. We didn't really touch too much on the offensive rebounding, but you really see it there for North Carolina because that's really how he got on the floor at the beginning of the year. Consistently that's how he generated offense, was really crashing the offensive glass. So when he can load leap, I think that he's actually pretty bouncy and he has a lot of force. Like that, you see that a little bit of that speed to power. Maybe if he attacks a closeout, you see him load up, and I think he can be actually a real problem there. But as far as functionally on the court, how the overall tools actually project to the next level, I think you have to look at the agility, like we've already talked about. The lack of the depreciation in movement skills for me is really important with him to meeting his overall ceiling outcome. I think Connor made the point about his drives in traffic and like his 1-foot pop. I've noticed that isn't as good as I thought it would be. Lower levels, I thought that he did show more 1-foot bounce, and that impacts his ability to play on the ball and like play a traditional pick and roll setting outside of the handling deficiencies. But he's got a great frame, and we've already seen him. He added a lot of girth, again, in a very short amount of time. A frame that can do that, like there's not a lot of guys who can really do that. Like Julius Randle had that kind of frame where he can just put on weight and like detract it. I think that is a factor here. And I think that if he gets trimmed down, he gets a more athletic build, maybe we see those plus athletic traits come back.
It is entirely possible that he's gone through bulking season and now it's time for cutting season for Nassir Little. So I will be interested to see what he can do from there. Let's move on and talk about his intelligence. I do want to get through this so we can do a little comparison. Let's talk about his intelligence. Eustacchio, you want to break that down for us?
We have his court awareness graded as a 4.3, his situational awareness as a 4.3 as well, his decision-making and decisiveness both graded as a 4.0, and his anticipation is a 5.0.
I have been actually super worried about his decision making. I don't think he's a great decision maker. He gets rushed a lot. That has been a big worry of mine. And then of course on the defensive end, he's late on rotations. He's not where he's supposed to be a lot of the time. Sometimes he just looks outright lost, particularly on the defensive end. And this is a little bit of a worry for me because I'm not sure how much of it you put on the feet of Carolina is a little bit more system oriented. They try to, instead of letting you be more free flowing, they kind of focus on if thens on the defensive end. And so I'm not sure how much of it is Nassir Little trying to adjust to what Roy Williams and Carolina do, or how much of it is he's just not quite there mentally. What do you guys think about, like, is it 6-1, half dozen the other, or what do you think?
So with me, I think that it's probably a little bit of both. I'm not high on his decision making either. Like Cole said, I think the game's just a little bit too fast for him right now, especially on the offensive end. We just see a lot of indecision there. And one of the things that I think contributes to him not having a lot of value as a passer off the dribble as well. With court awareness, I think that's something that you see a lot on defense. There were a few times in the Gonzaga games where you'd see him sort of not realize that he was the last line of rim protection for the team. I think one of them was when they blitzed a pick and roll and he just ran over to the guy on the perimeter and they just swung the ball and got a wide open dunk. And then the other one was Josh Perkins' no-look pass where it seemed like Little didn't even know that he was guarding Brandon Clark after a switch. And then with his situational awareness, I wanted to talk about that because I said his off-ball D looks a little bit better. He's still late on rim rotations. I think a lot of that is a lack of communication between the guys in Carolina's defense. But other than that, I think that he's sort of improved just a little bit as a weak side defender, and particularly over the course of the season, making rim rotations from the weak side. And then with his decisiveness, I think that contributes to all the other factors where it just decision making in general, if it's not quick, you're not going to be decisive. So I think that his intelligence is definitely something that needs to raise his level. That could raise his level of play if he starts to get a higher basketball IQ.
Some of this, at least, can be attributed to the situation. I think he displayed better intelligence on the court early in the season when he was playing more just free-flowing and natural, as opposed to trying to execute the scheme, more so the if-thens that Alex was talking about. It seems like as the season has progressed, he's playing very tentatively, and he's playing with the bench unit, obviously, and it's almost like he's afraid to make mistakes because he's afraid he's going to lose the little playing time he has, and that's almost making him just play worse. And I don't know. It's tough to. It just seems very different from the clips that we see of him in high school, with how engaged he was on defensive possessions and how much he cared about it, that he's just thinking so much on the court and not executing. And it's hard to figure out how much of that is on him and how much of that is the situation, and if it will get better in the NBA. But I think there's at least a chance that we see growth in this area. What do you think about that, Cole?
Yeah, I think the delineation between the effort and the competitive fire and kind of how he approaches the game versus the intelligence is really important here, because I bought the competitive fire at lower levels. Like, he really tried on defense. He showed that fire. That's part of why I really liked him. But the intelligence, I've never really seen at a high level. And that's something I didn't try to assess that much at AAU because I don't watch that much AAU. So to contextualize that, I didn't want to knock him for something that I'm just not used to seeing. But nothing really pops for him as a positive as far as how he thinks the game at the college level so far. I mean, maybe some of it's situation, but it's never been something he's really been known for. You see him lapse on defense, and this is kind of the dichotomy between effort and intelligence. You see him lapse off the ball on defense, and he'll bust his ass to recover, and you'll see the speed, but he's already given up that advantage. So I think you look at that, the decision-making on offense clearly isn't there. He hasn't been put in a lot of leverage situations as far as pick and roll, isolation to really create looks for his teammates, but we haven't seen it. Like, when he does, he looks uncomfortable. I mentioned he takes some of these forced pull-up jump shots because that's the only thing he really falls back on. So that's a huge issue for me, because when you look at prospects, if you don't have a modicum of feel, if you don't have like a threshold that you meet at how you feel the game, it's just really tough. Like, he reminds me a little bit of Jaylen Brown. I know that's a popular comparison. He's not the athlete Jaylen was, especially at his current state as far as physically, but he's really, really smart. Like, if you hear him talk, he's a really intelligent person. And I think that he's going to pick up on concepts and he's going to absolutely maximize what he has. I just don't know if the on-court instincts and intelligence is there to the level that I'd need to bet on high in the draft.
Let's move on and talk a little bit about his hustle. This is something, we touched on a little bit during that segment. And I think that he has a little bit more hustle, and he shows it, but he shows it in those ways where he is making up for something. So, Eustacchio, what do you see in his hustle grades?
So we have him graded as a 5.7 in motor, a 6.7 on the offensive glass, and 4.7 on the defensive glass. Then in transition offense as a 6.3, but in transition defense a 4.0.
Yeah, so to me, we were kind of talking about sort of like the intersection between IQ, effort levels, sort of him being nervous of getting taken out. And I think another factor you have to put into that, and obviously I don't know all the internal factors on top of being sort of scared to get taken out, is just his overall frustration level with the situation that he's in. I think that, this guy is talented. I mean, every single person that had a mock draft or a big board or whatever coming into the season had him at least top 5, if not top 1 to 3. I mean, it's not like these people, everyone's like dumb. Obviously, people saw stuff in him. And one of the things that people loved about him was his effort level. I mean, that McDonald's All-American game that he played in, and I don't like to take away a lot from that, but that was like the most notorious, even for an all-star game, of just people just flat out not trying and not caring. And he was the only person that gave any effort. I mean, what's his name? Emmett Williams from LSU won Jordan Brand Classic MVP just by giving a crap on the floor during the All-Star game. I mean, so I mean that competitive fire that Cole talks about, I think is very true, and I think that's something that we will see again, and that's one of the things that keeps me most encouraged about him. But I think that just the overall situation, and particularly from a hustle standpoint in general, and even like we talked about with the intersection between off ball and IQ and effort. I mean, all that stuff sort of plays into the factors, but I think it doesn't really change the skills that we see as much as it changes just how hard he plays and how much more he can generate.
So let's go on and let's use exactly what you're talking about there, Connor, as a springboard. These two guys, we chose them sort of purposely. They were ranked 2 and 3 in their class coming in out of high school. We've talked about their switchability, what they can do on defense, and we've talked about a little bit of the downside. So, Cole, I'm going to throw this to you first. Do you see these guys in June? I mean, obviously that's far out and a million things can change between now and then, but do you see these guys competing for similar draft spots in terms of like what teams are looking for if they want to fill that forward spot, or do you see them sort of in different categories?
I just think they're way different players. Like, the concerns you have about Little are the IQ, the skill level on the floor, and Cam reaches thresholds on both of those. And with Cam, you're worried about the motor, the competitive fire, how engaged he's going to be. I'm not worried about Little at all there. I think you're going to get whatever he has, you're going to get on the floor, probably on a nightly basis. I just really trust his ability to approach the game consistently that way. I do think they're going to be intertwined at the top of the draft, though. We see ESPN, they came up with a recent mock draft. They actually have Nassir Little 3 and Cam Reddish 5, I believe. So they're going to be competing for spots, because I do think that NBA teams are going to buy Little's intangibles. I think they're going to buy the intelligence. They're going to buy the work ethic, kind of like they did Jaylen Brown to an extent. I think that's going to be the case again. And he's going to be squarely up there because he's put a lot of promising things on tape at lower levels. Maybe they think they can develop someone like that. So I don't really consider them similar. I think that they're just way different kinds of players. And I would feel much more comfortable betting on Reddish at this point, which is crazy considering what I felt, at lower levels. I was very much on the Nassir Little bandwagon, and I still want to believe in him, but he hasn't shown enough at the college level, especially as far as IQ, to where I could really feel comfortable taking him where I would draft Cam Reddish realistically.
I got to redirect this one. What particularly about Reddish, like comparatively, makes you more confident? I mean, you said it. You were a little bit more confident on Little coming into this. What specifically about Reddish translates to the next level better for you?
I just think right now he's a more reliable shooter at his size, and he has better skill level. Like he can dribble and pass in an off-ball role, and he's shown more team defense-wise as far as knowing where to be. I think Eustacchio mentioned this. I think I might have came down a little bit hard on Reddish's team defense instincts and like his anticipation. I'm actually a fan of that. I don't think he's like D'Anthony Melton, which is kind of my point. He's a plus for me. He just looks like he knows what he's doing far more on the floor than Little does. And if Little's not going to be the same caliber of athlete that he was before, that was his big advantage over Reddish to me, was like Little's was just a much better athlete. Like I'd never bought the Cam Reddish primary, like Tracy McGrady stuff. He was just never that caliber of athlete to me. But if you're going to reframe it and say, who has the more projectable role that I know will be valuable in some capacity? If you believe in Cam Reddish's shot, I just think it has to be him.
Eustacchio, I mean, let's throw the same question back. Like, do you agree with the points Cole made? Do you see things a little bit differently there?
Yeah, I mean, I think the points about role are very valid here because Cam Reddish, it's a seamless fit. The 3-and-D role, everybody wants 3-and-D players nowadays. It works with any team. Little, the question is, what are you going to do with him if this is his skill set? He's good at finishing at the rim. He's good at crashing the offensive glass. He plays with a high motor. He has good tools, but what offensive role are you really going to slide him into with that? Those are big man skills, but you aren't playing him at the 5 on defense. So if you're using him in that role, you need a floor spacing big to play alongside him. It creates lineup issues. It's difficult to put him in the role that's going to succeed with the skill set he's displayed at college. Now, on the other hand, the question is, can he do more? If he's able to regain that agility, that quickness, is there a possibility of him developing a broader skill set more suited to the NBA wing? And I think that's where the appeal is with Nassir Little, where some NBA team will buy his stock pretty early in the lottery, probably, hoping that they can develop more than what they've seen at the college level, because based on what they've put on film to date, Reddish is just the better player. Even though his tools aren't as good, he's just more usable in the modern NBA. But there's that allure that Nassir Little could perhaps be more than he's seemed to be so far.
All right, Connor, well, I guess you're the last man standing. Do you kind of agree with the other guys have touched on, or do you have something to add to it?
Yeah, I kind of agree with it. I think that one thing that I just wanted to throw out there is when we talked about sort of them fighting for the same draft spot, which I think is very realistic. But at the same time, in my opinion, I probably wouldn't consider them, in my eyes, being in the same position. I think that Little's going to walk into a gym for a pre-draft workout, and he's immediately going to pass the eye test before he even steps on the court. I mean, some owner, GM's going to fall in love with him just by looking at him. And I think that him playing 1-on-0 is going to help him as well. But I think that you'd rather have Cam Reddish. I think, like they said, his skill set's so much more valuable, and you got to believe in the IQ. And I'm a big believer in players with high IQs succeed, and players without high IQs really don't. So I'm not saying he's not going to succeed, because I think he would definitely bet on his development in the future. But right now, I would say that Cam Reddish is probably competing for like a top 5 spot in my eyes, and Little's more competing for like back into the lottery, like 10 to 14.
I'm going to throw in one thing, and I think this happens every year. We have somebody who comes into the combine, comes into these pre-draft workouts, and basically from the time that the tournament ends till the NBA draft, there's always one guy who grows. And I want to put Nassir Little's name as a tentatively beside that right now. I think that he's a guy who has shown a lot at other levels. He hasn't had a chance to show it. And I believe in his mind, knowing what I know about him, I believe in his mind that he has he believes he has a lot more to contribute and that he's not being utilized well. And I think once he sort of gets outside of the system of North Carolina, he's going to be able to show those things a little bit more. And I think he's a guy who, he might be, if he's as high as 5 on some boards, I'm not sure how much higher he goes, but if he's one of those guys who's in the teens, at 10 or at 9 or something like that, when we get into the summer part of the postseason, I think he's a guy who can jump up because he really is capable in a lot of ways. Particularly if he can cut some weight, add some quickness back, and just show that he's capable of playing multiple positions. I think totally what you guys have said is on point. But at the same time, I'd like to say that I think Nassir Little will be able to show things after he gets done with school that are going to really enhance his draft stock. And I don't want to make a player comp because you guys know I don't love making player comps, but I'm going to make a situation. I'm going to make a situation comp. This reminds me a lot of what happened with Kevin Knox last year. It's that Kevin Knox was a certain player when he was at Kentucky. He didn't play alongside a lot of spacing. And then once he got outside of that role, they saw him, teams saw him, the Knicks, other teams that looked at him saw him in a different way. And I think situationally, while I'm not making a player comparison again, situationally, I think there's some congruency between what is going on with Nassir Little at UNC and what went on with Kevin Knox, that maybe he is not being featured in what will eventually be his NBA role when he is playing in his NCAA. Guys, you got anything else on this before we wrap it up? I mean, I feel like we've taken up a lot of the people's time, but I don't want to leave it hanging out there without any other points. Anybody got anything? Good? Cool. All right. Before we go, I guess, Connor, you got anything important that you want to tell us about? Anything you got going on the hopper that you're pumped about?
Yeah, I'm working on a big board right now. I mean, it's just going to be a 30 prospect big board, but I want it to try to be a little more unconventional where I have values of each of the 30 players on there. I'm probably about like 5 or 6 players left in. So with my schedule, it's kind of hard to get stuff done in a significant amount of time, but I'm going to try to push it out by like the end of the week.
You can follow Connor on Twitter at Harr. Connor, and Connor, what you're talking about is actually just life. Being able to get things out in a timely manner. That's just how life works. Eustacchio, what about you? What are you working on? Anything that we need to be keeping our eye on?
Well, we're working hard on the draft guide still, so that'll be a couple weeks away, but you can look for that coming up in the relatively near future. But that's about it.
All right. You can follow Eustacchio on Twitter at EVR1022. And then, of course, our guest this evening, Mr. Cole Zwicker. You can follow him on Twitter at Cole Zwicker. He works with the Setpien. He does amazing work. His video a couple of weeks ago on Zion Williamson was fantastic. You should definitely check it out. Cole, what are you working on right now?
I'm just trying to get caught up with all the damn prospects. I feel like when you watch the NBA, it becomes absolutely ridiculous during this time of year when there's like 5 or 6 college games you have to get to on a nightly basis. So I've been trying to get to this Jackson Hayes piece because I've been kind of higher on him throughout the last couple of weeks. Sam Bassini just wrote a piece on him, so I'm probably just not going to do it. I've talked enough about him on a podcast, but I'm going to have thoughts like I'm not going to do a big board midseason, but I'll have like midseason thoughts on basically all of the guys that I think are like relevant to like the first round and first round grades or whatnot. So look for that on the site. I want to say tentatively, maybe by later next week, I should have it done.
It seems to me that you've been watching the NBA and the NCAA. Like, I don't know how you have any time to get things done in your life with the amount of basketball that you're watching.
You just got to clear a room, man. I got to see how guys project and like get a better sense of that. So just having a prior on these guys is so valuable. Like if you watch these guys in college and a little bit of AAU in high school and seeing the progression, I think that's where the money is as far as projecting guys. You just got to see how they fit, how long it takes them to translate, all of that stuff. So I just think it's a really important part of the process.
Well, Cole, we appreciate you coming on, appreciate you being a part of everything that we do, and we appreciate all your takes on Nassir Little and Cam Reddish, so we hope to have you back sometime soon, man.
Of course, man. Thanks for having me.
All right, guys, that's all the time we have on the Red Team Draft Podcast for Connor and for Eustacchio and for Josh Earl, who you should follow at 2RedJEarl on Twitter, who could not be with us this week, but will definitely be back next week. We appreciate you listening, and we'll see you next time on the Red Team Draft Podcast.